The Viking Age is the period A.D. from late 8th century to mid-11th century in European history, especially Northern European and Scandinavian history. Following the Germanic Iron Age, it is the period of history when Scandinavian Norsemen explored Europe by its seas and rivers for trade, raids and conquest. In this period, the Norsemen settled in Norse Greenland, Newfoundland, and present-day Faroe Islands, Iceland, Normandy, Scotland, England, Ukraine, Ireland, Russia, Germany, and Anatolia. Though Viking travelers and colonists were seen at many points in history as brutal raiders, many historical documents suggest that their invasion of other countries was retaliation in response to the encroachment upon tribal lands by Christian missionaries, and perhaps by the Saxon wars prosecuted by Charlemagne and his kin to the south, or were motivated by overpopulation, trade inequities, and the lack of viable farmland in the homeland. Information about the Viking Age is drawn largely from what was written about the Vikings by their enemies, and primary sources of archaeology, supplied with secondary sources like the Icelandic sagas. Historical considerations. In England, the beginning of the Viking Age is dated to the 8th of June 793, when Vikings destroyed the abbey on Lindisfarne, a centre of learning on an island off the northeast coast of England in Northumberland. Monks were killed in the abbey, thrown into the sea to drown, or carried away as slaves along with the church treasures, giving rise to the traditional prayer, A furore Normanorum libera nos, Domine, from the fury of the Northmen deliver us, Lord. 3 Viking ships had beached in Portland Bay 4 years earlier, but that incursion may have been a trading expedition that went wrong rather than a piratical raid. Lindisfarne was different. The Viking devastation of Northumbria's Holy Island was reported by the Northumbrian scholar Alcuin of York, who wrote, "Never before in Britain has such a terror appeared." Vikings were portrayed as uniformly violent and bloodthirsty by their enemies. The chronicles of medieval England portrayed them as rapacious wolves among sheep. The first challenges to the many anti-Viking images in Britain emerged in the 17th century. Pioneering scholarly works on the Viking Age reached a small readership in Britain. Archaeologists began to dig up Britain's Viking past. Linguistics traced the Viking Age origins of rural idioms and proverbs. New dictionaries of the Old Norse language enabled more Victorians to read the Icelandic sagas. In Scandinavia, the 17th-century Danish scholar Thomas Bartholin and Ole Worm and Swedish scholar Olaus Rudbeck were the first to use runic inscriptions and Icelandic sagas as primary historical sources. During the Enlightenment and Nordic Renaissance, historians such as the Danish-Norwegian Ludvig Holberg and Swedish Olaf von Dalen developed a more rational and pragmatic approach to historical scholarship. By the latter half of the 18th century, while the Icelandic sagas were still used as important historical sources, the Viking Age had again come to be regarded as a barbaric and uncivilized period in the history of the Nordic countries. Not until the 1890s, during Victoria's reign in Britain, did scholars outside Scandinavia begin to extensively reassess the achievements of the Vikings, recognizing their artistry, technological skills, and seamanship. Until recently, however, the history of the Viking Age was still largely based on Icelandic sagas. The history of the Danes written by Saxo Grammaticus, the Karavanr's primary chronicle, and the War of the Irish with the foreigners. Today most scholars take these texts as sources not to be understood literally and are relying more on concrete archaeological findings, numismatics and other direct scientific disciplines and methods. Historical background. The Vikings who invaded Western and Eastern Europe were chiefly pagans from Denmark, Norway and Sweden. They also settled in the Faroe Islands, Ireland, Iceland, peripheral Scotland, Greenland, and Canada. The North Germanic language, Old Norse, became the mother tongue of present-day Scandinavian languages. By 801, a strong central authority appears to have been established in Jutland, and the Danes were beginning to look beyond their own territory for land, trade and plunder. In Norway, mountainous terrain and fjords formed strong natural boundaries. Communities that remained independent of each other, unlike the situation in Denmark, which is lowland. By 800, some 30 small kingdoms existed in Norway. The sea was the easiest way of communication between the Norwegian kingdoms and the outside world. It was in the 8th century that Scandinavians began to build ships of war and send them on raiding expeditions to initiate the Viking Age. The North Sea rovers were traders, colonizers and explorers as well as plunderers. Probable causes of Norse expansion. Norse society was based on agriculture and trade with other people and placed great emphasis on the concept of honor, both in combat and in the criminal justice system. It was, for example, unfair and wrong to attack an enemy already in a fight with another. This era coincided with the medieval warm period and stopped with the start of the Little Ice Age. The start of the Viking Age, with the sack of Lindisfarne, also coincided with Charlemagne's Saxon Wars, or Christian wars with pagans in Saxony. Historians Rudolf Sumek and Bruno Dumesel theorize that the Viking attacks may have been in response to the spread of Christianity among pagan peoples. Professor Rudolf Sumek believes that it is not a coincidence if the early Viking activity occurred during the reign of Charlemagne. Because of the penetration of Christianity in Scandinavia, serious conflict divided Norway for almost a century. With the means of travel, the desire for goods led Scandinavian traders to explore and develop extensive trading partnerships in new territories. It has been suggested that the Scandinavians suffered from unequal trade practices imposed by Christian advocates and that this eventually led to the breakdown in trade relations and raiding. British merchants who declared openly that they were Christian and would not trade with heathens and infidels would get preferred status for availability and pricing of goods through a Christian network of traders. A two-tiered system of pricing existed with both declared and undeclared merchants trading secretly with band parties. Viking raiding expeditions were separate from and coexisted with regular trading expeditions. A people with the tradition of raiding the neighbors when their honor had been impugned might easily fall to raiding foreign peoples who impugned their honor. Historians also suggest that the Scandinavian population was too large for the peninsula and there was not enough good farmland for everyone. This led to a hunt for more land, particularly for the settlement and conquest period that followed the early raids. Internal strife in Scandinavia resulted in the progressive centralization of power into fewer hands. Formerly empowered local lords who did not want to be oppressed by greedy kings emigrated overseas. Iceland became Europe's first modern republic, with an annual assembly of elected officials called the Althing, though only Gothi had the right to vote there. Historic overview. The earliest date given for a Viking raid is 789 AD when, according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a group of men from Norway sailed to the Isle of Portland in Dorset, although due to a scribal error the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle dates this event to 787. There, they were mistaken for merchants by a royal official. They murdered him when he tried to get them to accompany him to the king's manor to pay a trading tax on the goods. The beginning of the Viking Age in the British Isles is, however, often given as 793. It was recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that the Northmen raided the important island monastery of Lindisfarne, AD 793. This year came dreadful forewarnings over the land of the Northumbrians, terrifying the people most woefully. These were immense sheets of light rushing through the air, and whirlwinds, and fiery dragons flying across the firmament. These tremendous tokens were soon followed by a great famine, and not long after, on the 6th day before the Ides of January in the same year, the harrowing inroads of heathen men made lamentable havoc in the Church of God in Holy Island, by rapine and slaughter. In 794, according to the Annals of Ulster, there was a serious attack on Lindisfarne's mother house of Iona, which was followed in 795 by raids upon the northern coast of Ireland. From bases there, the Norsemen attacked Iona again in 802, causing great slaughter amongst the acute brethren, and burning the abbey to the ground. The end of the Viking Age is traditionally marked in England by the failed invasion attempted by the Norwegian King Harald III, who was defeated by Saxon King Harold Godwinson in 1066 at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in Ireland, the capture of Dublin by Strongbow and his Hiberno-Norman forces in 1171, and 1263 in Scotland by the defeat of King Haakon Hakonison at the Battle of Lugs by troops loyal to Alexander III. Godwinson was subsequently defeated within a month by another Viking descendant, William, Duke of Normandy, in 911. Scotland took its present form when it regained territory from the Norse between the 13th and the 15th centuries. The Western Isles and the Isle of Man remained under Scandinavian authority until 1266. Orkney and Shetland belonged to the King of Norway as late as 1469. In Scandinavia, the Viking Age is considered to have ended with the establishment of royal authority in the Scandinavian countries and the establishment of Christianity as the dominant religion. The date is usually put somewhere in the early 11th century in all three Scandinavian countries. The end of the Viking era in Norway is marked by the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030. Although Olaf Haraldsson's army lost the battle, Christianity spread, partly on the strength of rumors of miraculous signs after his death. Norwegians would no longer be called Vikings. In Sweden, the reign of King Olaf Konung is considered to be the transition from the Viking Age to the Middle Ages, because he was the first Christian king of the Swedes, and he is associated with a growing influence of the Church in what is today southwestern and central Sweden. The clinker-built longships used by the Scandinavians were uniquely suited to both deep and shallow waters. They extended the reach of Norse raiders, traders and settlers along coastlines and along the major river valleys of northwestern Europe. Rurik also expanded to the east and in 859 became ruler either by conquest or invitation by local people of the city of Novgorod on the Volkhov River. His successors moved further, founding the early East Slavic state of Kievan Rus with the capital in Kiev. This persisted until 1240, when the Mongols invaded Russia. Other Norse people, particularly those from the area that is now modern-day Sweden and Norway, continued south to the Black Sea and then on to Constantinople. Whenever these Viking ships ran aground in shallow waters, the Vikings would reportedly turn them on the sides and drag them across the shallows into deeper waters. The eastern connections of these Varangians brought Byzantine silk coins from Samarkand, even a cowrie shell from the Red Sea, to Viking York. The kingdom of the Franks under Charlemagne was particularly hard hit by these raiders, who could sail up the Seine with near impunity. Near the end of Charlemagne's reign, a string of Norse raids began, culminating in a gradual Scandinavian conquest and settlement of the region now known as Normandy. In 911, French King Charles the Simple was able to make an agreement with the Viking war leader Rollo, a chieftain of disputed Norwegian or Danish origins. Charles gave Rollo the title of Duke and granted him and his followers possession of Normandy. In return, Rollo swore fealty to Charles, converted to Christianity, and undertook to defend the northern region of France against the incursions of other Viking groups. Several generations later, the Norman descendants of these Viking settlers not only identified themselves as Norman but carried the Norman language and the Norman culture into England in 1066. With the Norman conquest, they became the ruling aristocracy of Anglo-Saxon England. Geography. There are various theories concerning the causes of the Viking invasions. For people living along the coast, it would seem natural to seek new land by the sea. Another reason was that during this period England, Wales and Ireland, which were divided into many different warring kingdoms, were in internal disarray and became easy prey. The Franks, however, had well-defended coasts and heavily fortified ports and harbors. Pure thirst for adventure may also have been a factor. A reason for the raids is believed by some to be overpopulation caused by technological advances, such as the use of iron, or a shortage of women due to selective female infanticide. Although another cause could well have been pressure caused by the Frankish expansion to the south of Scandinavia and the subsequent attacks upon the Viking peoples. Another possible contributing factor is that Harald I of Norway had united Norway around this time, and the bulk of the Vikings were displaced warriors who had been driven out of his kingdom and who had nowhere to go. Consequently, these Vikings became raiders, in search of subsistence and bases to launch counter-raids against Harald. One theory that has been suggested is that the Vikings would plant crops after the winter and go raiding as soon as the ice melted on the sea, then returned home with the loot, in time to harvest the crops. One important center of trade was at Hedby, close to the border with the Franks. It was effectively a crossroads between the cultures, until its eventual destruction by the Norwegians in an internecine dispute around 1050. York was the center of the kingdom of Jorvik from 866, and discoveries that suggest that Scandinavian trade connections in the 10th century reached beyond Byzantium. However, those items could also have been Byzantine imports, and there is no reason to assume that the Varangians traveled significantly beyond Byzantium and the Caspian Sea.